So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chris Pine and Stephen Markley.
All right.
Hey, man.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I feel like this has been so natural already. So.
I feel like we're supposed to be an Abbott and Costello routine. This is the last stop on your tour.
That's right. Yeah.
You've been gone for how long?
Just a week.
You've been doing, I don't want to throw you under the bridge, but some drinking in Texas, apparently.
Yeah, a few author friends from the Iowa Writers Workshop and I, had ourselves a time.
Okay. Well, I'm very excited to be here. I loved Stephen's Ohio, which I'm sure many of you have read, and jumped straight into Deluge and read it in a week of Fast and Furious. And we'll get into some talk and some questions, but first I think you may want to read a little thing.
Yeah, I'm going to read a quick excerpt. This is from a... It's always hard to do the handheld thing with the reading. This is from a Vanity Fair article that will be published in 2026. It's called Kate Chaos and the Planet's Last Stand. Once an anonymous foot soldier in an underfunded climate justice group, Kate Morrison, a fierce blue fire, defied party politics, upended the midterm elections, and have reignited momentum on the climate crisis. Moniza Faruqi profiles the frank, funny, fearless woman who has stormed to the front of the movement, even though she may not be welcome there. So this is from Kate's speech in Phoenix. She's sort of barnstorming the country. So she turns to the screen. Here's my whole presentation. Soak it up. The logo behind her switches to 430 ppm, parts per million. I'm not telling you anything new. That is the carbon dioxide level of the atmosphere today. We started at around 280 before the Industrial Revolution. We know the absolute safe upper threshold is 350, which the world blew by in the 90s, and it's still rising at the rate of 2 to 3 parts per million every year. It's as simple as this. The fate of every man, woman, child, and species on this planet is bound to this number. Nothing matters unless we can stop and eventually reverse that number. She steps back from the podium and decides to pull her hair into a bun, swiftly snatching a hair tie from her wrist and running her hand over her face to collect loose strands as she speaks. She gives a quick lesson in the basic physics and chemistry of greenhouse gas emissions. Simple enough that when Svante Arrhenius made a few back-of-the-envelope calculations in 1896, he predicted that if smokestacks continued to belch CO2, the planet would eventually warm by 3 to 6 degrees centigrade. This remains exactly in line with what the most sophisticated computer models still say today. What most scientists have been wrong about, Morris continues, is how quickly our planet's systems could unravel given this additional heat. The chaos we're seeing is from just a 1.2 degree temperature rise. Now we have feedback loops to fear. Her hands make swift, enormous gesticulations, a conductor building urgency for her symphony, as she describes the Amazon's epic droughts, releasing 6 billion tons of CO2, equivalent to annual U.S. emissions. She moves on to the permafrost in the tundra of Alaska, northern Canada, and Siberia. Finally, she describes the deposits of methane throughout the world's oceans. Scientists hoped it would take centuries for methane clathrates to melt, but they're already discovering plumes venting from the Arctic Ocean during sea ice retreats. The first ice-free Arctic summer will probably arrive in the next 5 to 10 years. And rather than white ice reflecting sunlight, the dark ocean absorbs it. Yet another feedback loop imperiling the highly dangerous clathrates. For anyone who hasn't read Anthony Pietrus's terrifying book, at that point, there is no adaptation, no survival, no Earth. The entire surface of the planet will be too hot to sustain life. So we're not just talking about fucking polar bears here. We're talking about the violent disintegration of civilization, followed by a slow-rolling global genocide, and it's underway right now. In other words, it might already be too late. Here is the absolute best-case scenario of where we are. She leaves the podium and approaches the edge of the stage. She stops with her toes on the precipice and leans forward, outstretched arms quivering in tight, tiny circles for balance. She teeters forward impossibly far, and one can easily picture her sprawling face first into the front row, cracking her chin open or worse. There's a palpable anxiety to watching her perform this feat, the crowd tensing at this gut-clenching display, the spotlight spilling her long shadow across the stage. 2,000 mouths exhale with relief when she finally catches hold of her momentum and tilts back from the edge. She smiles at herself and returns to the podium. Again, that is our best-case scenario. We have a precious handful of years left to act, and I promise you this. If you do not join this movement now, you will wake up 10, 15, 20 years from now and feel sick that you didn't do everything you could during the sliver of time when we still had a chance, when we hadn't yet fallen over the brink. I've heard this speech multiple times by now, but there is something acute about the blanket silence that engulfs this crowd. Morris checks her notebook on the lectern. So what does that mean? First of all, forget about your carbon footprint. Carbon footprint is a PR term invented by an oil company. I want you to remember 2 words. These words are placed 430 behind her. They knew. They are the carbon majors, the 100 companies responsible for over 70% of emissions since the 80s. Their own scientists knew what would happen. They knew if they kept burning their reserves, they would threaten the future of the human race. They knew, and they built their oil rigs to account for higher sea levels and more intense storms. They knew, and they told us to focus on our consumer behavior while they locked us all into structures of hyperconsumption. They knew, and they waged a propaganda war of denial and delay. They knew, and they're still doing it. There is no other way to put it. They are committing the greatest atrocity in human history, and they knew. They knew, and they told us to worry about our fucking carbon footprints. I'll stop there.
And this is why you've written the best comedy of 2023. Well, there's so much to unpack there. Is that indeed true that the carbon majors built their oil rigs to account for rising levels of ocean?
Yes, the LA Times and Inside Climate News, a journalistic outfit that focuses on climate change, actually did this fantastic report on basically everything Exxon and other oil companies knew back in the 70s. So they have understood exactly what was going to happen since then, and have basically, like Kate says, waged a propaganda war to keep us from doing anything about it.
So I'm sure you did an incredible amount of research. Is there just one, the most nefarious thing that these people did that you can point to? I mean, that's pretty bad, the oil rigs, but.
Well, I mean, in the 90s, they formed this organization called the Global Climate Coalition or something, which is sort of, like the Sustainable Future Coalition in the book, one of these sort of industry puppet things that goes around trying to stop people from successfully combating climate change, right? So just like when we hear about climate denialism, that doesn't just birth out of people's heads naturally. It's part of a sustained campaign that's been going on for 30 years.
So this is such a huge book, and there's so much information. We were talking beforehand, and I was telling Stephen that it felt like it's part like master's class in climate change science, and it's also this blistering narrative. And how did you manage to corral this whole beast of 700 some odd pages that has so much incredible information, but also is just a moving freight train of a great narrative?
Yeah, I mean, it took 12 years for a reason. I got to the end and turned in my first draft to my editor after I'd made substantial cuts to the manuscript, and it was still 1,500 pages. So beginning in 2020 to 2022, I cut 600 pages. I cut a third of the book from the actual manuscript. And that is a wrenching process. Writers have different problems. Some writers face the blank page, and that's the hard problem. Mine is I vomit everything out, and then I have to crawl around in the vomit and figure out what I've done. And yeah, it's tough.
Well, that's a good question. It comes to process, which I'm really fascinated by. I mean, you obviously you don't have a problem with production at an incredible level. You started this 10 plus years ago, is that right?
Yeah, 2010.
And you started this before Ohio.
I almost started them simultaneously, really.
And can you just talk, was there an inciting incident that made you want to tackle an issue like climate change?
I mean, as a young person, I was politically activated. I think we're about the same age. I sort of came of age during the Iraq War, which was a really jarring experience. And, the more I became engaged, the more I kept looking back to this issue. As not just the most important issue of my lifetime, but really of anyone's lifetime since human beings first evolved, basically. Once you really start to look at it, the implications of what we're doing to the planet are so enormous and so frightening that it's really hard to be alarmed enough, right? And, also as a young person who wanted to be a writer, wanted to be a storyteller, that was what my brain began to work on. How do I take this issue and narrativize it, but also not in a preachy way, not in a pedantic way, not in a way that is sort of scolding the reader, but sort of allowing them to go on the emotional journey that I went through writing the book.
Well, and what I guess my question, so we all live in the world and we all experience climate change on a daily, but what made it so personal to you? I mean, you obviously have a passion for it, just like you had a passion for the effects of PTSD and the opiate crisis that you delved into it in Ohio.
I mean, I am like not an environmentalist per se. Like I'm still driving a gas car right now. Don't tell anyone. I eat meat sometimes. I try to recycle, but I fuck it up occasionally too. I threw the other day down the chute in my apartment building, the trash and the recycling thing, and the recycling and the trash thing. I didn't sleep the whole night. But I think like my what has drawn me to this issue is not about these abstract things. It's not about polar bears, even though we should save the polar bears. It is about the intimacy of it. Like this issue is about everyone we love and care about and everyone we ever will love and care about. Like this is about our friends and our family and sort of our collective love for each other. So how can we not tackle this issue? How can we not face it? And I think that is sort of the core of the climate crisis that has driven me.
The one thing I was thinking is as the story I was going to say progresses. There's no progressing. It's just like I said, a freight train. It just gets worse and worse and progressively apocalyptic and awful and awful and awful. Were you concerned at all that it was just too much? Were you wanting to make a point that this is exactly what will happen? Were you following science and logic about what would happen if one domino fell, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, my rule for writing the book was to not stray from what the science is telling us. Like, sure, there are massive events and they are on the outer edge, but it definitely was something where I want to keep this as realistic as possible. The idea behind the book is that, this sets in motion a set of cascading events that makes it impossible for our civilization to function, right? And so I set this epic sort of economic crisis in motion. And then I had to figure out, okay, well, what would we actually do about it? And I had to go about doing the research, like how would our government respond? How would we respond to actually, attack this problem?
So, and are you doing your own research and it's just you're digging into mounds of paper? Are you talking to scientists?
I am reading everything I can get my hands on. I'm annoying people over email. I am trying to speak to as many people in different sort of facets of this world as possible. And it's, there's never any one book or paper or person that sort of like triggers it. It's just mash it all up, put it in the blender, and then sort of pour out this nice smoothie of a story.
So when you're...
You like that one, yeah.
There's a ton of information. There are a lot of narratives happening. There are just a ton of characters. How do you keep them all straight? And how do you, as a wannabe writer myself, keep track of stylistically and characterologically how these people speak, what they want, how they sound?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like one of my abilities as a writer that I don't struggle that much with, which is keeping big amounts of story in my head. The sort of 5-part setup of the book was exactly what I thought of in like 2007, 2008, as I was first dreaming this up. And that's about what came out. And so throughout the writing process, I sort of had my North Star of how I wanted the book to work and feel. And then it was just all a matter of sort of moving the pieces around on the chessboard. I had my document running alongside of it. I had, the cards on the board, but ultimately I knew how I wanted it to be executed, which was building, like you said, that momentum of a freight train. So that by the time you're like a third of the way through the book, you're so caught up in it, it doesn't feel like 900 pages anymore.
No, it feels very bingey. That's what I absolutely couldn't stop. I mean, you do a great job of we talk about the Trojan horse and like when you try to pitch a show, it's like, what are we actually trying to tell people? What's the quinoa and vegetables and, how do we give them the hamburger? You do a great job of feeding us the good hamburger. One of the relationships that I found most compelling in the book was between Kate and Matt. Kate, have you all read the book or no? You haven't read the book, no? Okay, I'm gonna parse my words carefully. Kate is the leader of this large environmental movement, and Matt's her husband or partner. I guess first thing, how did you come up with the character of Kate? She's such a force of nature. Did you look at someone in particular as a model? Was it a creation from whole cloth?
I think when coming up with a character, it's this like sort of set of 100 to 1,000 influences, and then you're just taking all of that stuff and moving it around like a Rubik's cube until you sort of have the person in your mind's eye, and then you start writing them, and they're not themselves at first, if you know what I mean. I wonder if you run into this, like trying to portray a character where the first couple times it's not really taking, and the first few versions of Kate, she was just a little too preachy, a little too irritating on the page, and then I was like, okay, this person has to be larger than life, and she has to actually affect the conversation, right? And the best way in my mind was to write about her was through somebody who was hopelessly in love with her, but who knew that love was damaging him emotionally all the time, right? And in doing so, it creates this effect, because Kate is obviously the sun at the center of the solar system of the book, and yet we're never really inside of her head. And so it's that distance we have with celebrity. That's that distance we have with people who are larger than life, where we don't fully grasp what they're about. And so the reader is going on Matt's same journey, trying to access this person who is so compelling, so passionate, but that they can't quite get there either.
I also really, what I found interesting about it too is I felt such a swap of traditional gender roles, at least historically speaking. Matt is this quiet supporter. She is such a fierce, ambitious woman. Was that an important thing for you to portray that?
Yeah, well, my first conception of the book was 7 cis white men save the world. And then I was like, oh, maybe that's not the best approach. This is going to go on the internet too. That was a real risk. No, I just, I was trying to like come up with a character who could embody the passion of this, and who could really like shock people out of a stupor, right? And when I myself was in Wyoming once, like Matt, he's not me, but sort of that experience was when I first started to think about, okay, what would a person like this be like? And so you take little cuts of your entire life experience and again put them in that blender.
So when you started Deluge and you started Ohio around the same time, and then you put Deluge aside to finish Ohio. Was there a reason why you put it aside? Were you overwhelmed by the darkness that you were researching?
Well, no, purely from a mercenary perspective, I was like, I can finish Ohio first. This is the easier book. And for anybody who's read Ohio, it's like, that's not an easy book. That was also a 500-page, like cutting out hundreds of pages of it, moving the parts of it around all the time. So it was just the simpler project. And then as soon as I had finished Ohio and actually like pushed it off to the printer, the 30 to 40% of the Deluge was still waiting for me. Only the world had gotten so much more fucking insane in that time that it almost wasn't scary enough. Right. So like I put it aside around 2015, picked it back up in 2017, maybe 2018. And at that point I was like, okay, this thing has to be as close to our political, economic, and social reality as possible, and sort of burn through the rest of the book in about 2 years.
So not only do you tackle climate change, you also get into, and you started this in Ohio, the opiate crisis, PTSD, veterans. Seems to be a real focal interest of yours. And in the Deluge, it's Murdoch and it's Keeper. What is your connection there to? I feel like you want to give voice to this part of America that you feel has been voiceless.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that. I just like, I grew up in Ohio, and that during the part of my life when I was coming of age, you're sort of seeing these things. And I think every young author, their first book is so much about trying to explicate where they came from and why it matters. No matter who you are, that's sort of like your impulse. And certainly the friends and acquaintances and frenemies I had growing up who went through those experiences became, incredible influences on my life. And I'm still friends with many of them. And I think to me, it was just like, this is my way of sort of explaining it to myself. This is my way of therapizing myself about, these really horrible sort of, things that were bestowed upon us, not chosen, right? Like the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the opioid crisis, those were things that were done to the population of the Midwest, of the country, right? And so to me, I feel like my work is always trying to connect these enormous forces, these political and economic forces, to the personal, to create that ligature between individual human beings and these incredible changes to our society.
I have a question about structure. So in this, you use first person, third person narrative. You have these little boxes where you go into either other people's viewpoints, or you go further into a particular topic or moment that you've raised on a page. How did this idea come up? Why did you decide to do it that way?
Well, yeah, no, it's a great question. I think at first you're just sort of writing from instinct. And then quickly I discovered why I was doing it, which is I sort of wanted the book to recreate the cacophony of our contemporary sort of information ecology, let's say, right? Like I wanted this book to sort of inundate people with information, not that so that it would be unreadable, right? But so that it would feel like the way we exist, which is just we are bombarded with information and with opinions and with emotions, and we don't even always know where they come from. Like that is sort of the goal of surveillance capitalism, right? And so there are these individual pages in each section that are just headlines, but all those headlines and all those voices. Well,
no voice anymore.
Exxon got a hold of it. Yeah,
I'll steal your
that is delightful. Actually, we better switch. This is stretching. There you go. Thank you. The information ecology. So, basically trying to give the reader, you don't know where all those voices are coming from. They're out of context, just like we read everything out of context, where we don't know where it all came from. And that sort of creates this sensation of, I'm not sure who to trust within the book itself. It's the unreliable narrator problem, but on a grand scale.
What do you like more, writing books or writing for television?
Oh, writing books. Even though some of my coworkers are here right now.
Let's just take out. Let's take out just a side step. How? I mean, you're such a brilliant author. How did you end up in Los Angeles writing for television? What's that process been like? Do you like Los Angeles? I mean, you've. I can't get that part away.
No, I burn it down in
the book. You do burn it down. You burn it down in the book, and there's a former actor that turns into a demagogue. But anyway, per my question.
I'm definitely going to play the clip of you saying that to my co-writers in the room when we're back at work. No, I mean, look, I love writing novels more than anything. It's my favorite thing to do is get up in the morning and just get back into whatever imaginary world I'm playing in, right?
Are you writing a book right now?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
How many books?
I have a 2-book deal, so I'm working on sort of 2 of them at the same time.
At the same time.
Yeah. But the experience of coming to Hollywood, and I'm working in this writer's room right now, and it's such a blast. Like I go to work every day and I just like laugh my ass off with a bunch of people who are like my new best friends, and it's just so much fucking fun.
Will you tell the David Milch story?
Yeah, I mean that's how I ended up out here. I was at the University of Iowa. Woo, yeah. Let's go. I had no intention of coming out here, and David Milch visited to give a talk, and he sort of said, if anybody has a screenplay they'd like me to read, I'd be happy to. And I had this this script, this movie about college age drug dealers that I'd written like 2 years ago and not thought anything about. And I was like, well, why not? But I gave it to him, and he said, would you like my help getting an agent? And I said, yes, David Milch, creator of NYPD Blue and Deadwood. I would definitely like your help getting an agent. That sounds great.
What authors inspired you? Who did you read growing up, and who do you read now? And yeah.
I mean, I was a kid who sort of like would find one author and then read everything they'd ever done. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Stephen King, who's been a huge supporter of mine. I grew up just so infatuated with his writing. I would like tear through like Gerald's Game at age 12. You know, like it was like I had a sick problem, right? And so just to like have him like acknowledge my work as an adult is still, it makes me feel like I'm 12 years old again, right? But yeah, and I discovered Kurt Vonnegut. I think Slaughterhouse-Five was a really important book to me just because it was the first time that you read like a piece of literature, but it's like, oh, like literature doesn't have to be stodgy. It can be weird and have sex in it and have bad words. It's like it can be something so different, and that sort of opened my perception to like what one can do on the written page.
Who's writing right now that you find inspiring?
Oh my God. I mean, I just finished this book by George Saunders that I can't stop thinking about.
Which one?
A Swim in the Pond in the Rain.
Oh my God.
I think anybody who wants to be creative.
I just have it on my table right now.
I cannot recommend it enough.
Unpack that for.
Well, he just like makes you read Russian short stories like you're in his class, and then he writes little essays after them. And it's about craft, but it's also sort of about like, why do we do any of this? Like, why do we have art, you know? And I couldn't get enough of it. And then I have to mention this. I'm just so excited. I was at the Texas Book Festival, and my friends Derek Nuro and Escort David Johnson each have their debut novels out, and I have just started them, and I'm already like I can't wait. Like I can't wait to read both of them.
I think I'm done, guys. Does anybody have any questions to throw at our author?
Yeah. So in my first novel, Ohio, one of the main characters is an Iraq and Afghanistan veteran. And you know, his experience is sort of one of the prisms of how the book tells the story of the 2000s, basically. The sort of intersecting issues of those wars, of the Great Recession, of deindustrialization in the Midwest, and the opioid crisis. I mean, it's an awful process. It really is. And you know, eventually, because you've worked so hard on something, it's so hard to let go of it. But I had a wonderful editor, Stuart Roberts, who basically took a huge section of the book and was like, I think you should cut this entire section, which is, you know, amounted to like a good 300 pages. And it was really painful, and I really didn't want to do it. But as soon as it was gone, I understood why. And it goes to what you said. Like, this is a huge book that's asking a lot of the reader. It is asking an enormous amount of sort of one's intellectual capacity to engage with science, to engage with politics. And it has to move. It has to feel like a freight train. And so the entire point of the edit was get this book speeding. And so those parts, which were way more sort of explanatory, had to go. And I still like sometimes can't believe the amount of work I poured into it. But it's okay because the book is better without it.
Being a filmmaker, would this make a good film?
It'd be the most expensive film of all time. I mean, you'd have to find a really rich person or company. Of course it would. I mean, that's what I say. It's like a Netflix binge-worthy book meeting some sort of PhD doctorate in, I don't know, life science or something. It's really, really dense. I think the unfortunate thing is that the difficulty, I think, is that how do you avoid it feeling like Armageddon? It's so smart. It's so smart, and it's so erudite that you can only get some of this information on the page. You can't have 20 minutes of people, you know, it'd be a lot of exposition. And for the actor, that's a effing nightmare.
Let's go back here.
Oh wow. Well, I'm not. I wish I had Ohio in front of me because I'm sure there's. I'd have to revisit.
I mean, think you as Kate Morris would be great.
That's
like
very
that.
funny.
No one would.
That's very funny.
No one would have a problem with that.
That's very funny. I mean, there is the pastor, who's you will encounter in the book. Who's he's a B movie actor that becomes a messianic demagogue, and it's pretty far out. It's pretty funny. So probably I would say the pastor.
That's a great answer. I love that.
Is there something that you wanted the readers to be left with, like a specific lesson or moral at the end of it all?
I mean, not exact. I think it's really dangerous to create a piece of art from a perspective of like, here's exactly what I want someone to think afterwards. Then it becomes, a polemic instead of a piece of art, and it's a dangerous method to sort of employ. But obviously, I want people, as I said earlier, to feel the urgency of this crisis the way I do, and come away with both the realization of how scary it is, but also that there is a way out of this. That we have every technology we need, we know every policy we should implement to arrest this crisis at a safe place of 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature rise. And yeah, that's all I want people to be thinking about. And I think the way to do that is through the emotion of reading a narrative about people that feel as real to you as your loved ones. Yeah, right.
Do that creatively? How do you do that as a human being operating in Los Angeles?
I had wrote Ohio with an awful day job, so it's great to like be writing novels with a great day job. And to me, it's just like, yeah, like I think, I'm still learning about screenwriting. I feel like I'm basically new to it still. And, I want to eventually create something of my own. Right. And if that never happens, that's fine too. Like I am living exactly the life I wanted from back when I was 5 years old. Right. And I spent a lot of this very exhausting last week reminding myself that this is what you've worked so hard for, and you need to enjoy it and be in the moment and be present with it, because at some point nobody's going to care about me anymore, and no one will show up to my book events unless I get Tom Hanks. No offense. But no, I'm just having such a good time right now, and being out here and working with the people I'm working with is just pure joy and delight right now. So yeah.
Obviously it got published, but was there any apprehension from now?
They'd already paid me the advance, so they were out of luck. It's yeah, exactly. I think. Yeah. My editor said to me, he was like, he was so kind about the draft I turned in. He really was. And he was like, I see the great book in here. Now we have to carve it out of the rest of the marble. And that was the project. And it was the absolute hardest thing I've ever done professionally. It was really difficult. And it was during COVID too. So like the world's on fire. And I had to sort of like force myself to sit down and concentrate on this project, which I knew this is the most important work I'll probably ever do. Right. And so to sort of tell myself like, again, be present, be with this, and pay attention to it. And yeah, I'm just, again, grateful that I think it worked out.
I have one final question. When do you know you're done with a book? Like, when do you know done?
It's that old adage that book isn't finished, it's abandoned. And so I just abandoned it at the right time. That's I was still changing things up until the last minute. I had turned in fourth pass, which is sort of your last chance to change a single word. And what had happened was Joe Manchin in the United States Senate had said, we're done with this climate bill. And I was like, okay, well, that sucks. Our future is grim, but at least my novel makes perfect sense. And then a few weeks later, he voted to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, this enormous climate bill, which I feel doesn't get enough attention. And I, wept with relief, but was also like, fuck, this messes up my book. And so the paperback actually includes some alterations about the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So it's a few sentences, a few paragraphs where it actually like melds that present into the reality of the book. So this is just a sales pitch for the 3 hardcover copies, because those will now be worth something. I believe they have them in back. You can ask Dan.
I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you,
and thank
man.
you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
This was so awesome.